was a visitor. Oh, maybe that's who it was. Still, we've got a minute or two.
Oh, the musical sound of coffee being made. Can you hear it? Can you hear the musical sound of the coffee maker?
Wasn't it that song?
True gathering music to the Unitarian Universalist ear.
There was that.
Brad, do you want us to go? We're good.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning and welcome to Westside Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Linda Phippen. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'll be assisting with the service today. It's nice to see all of you here in person this morning, but we also welcome those of you who are joining us on YouTube, whether today in real time or sometime in the future. If you are here in person, we hope you will join us after the service for coffee, snacks, and conversation. If you're visiting, we'd love to meet you, but we're not pushy. If you'd prefer to hang back a bit and just observe us in our natural habitat, that would be fine too. Here at Westside, you will find welcome and acceptance of people with differing spiritual beliefs or non-beliefs, different identities or ways of life. We strive to center our lives in love and care for each other, our neighbors near and far, and the world in all its complexity of peoples, cultures, as well as other beings that share the world with us. Through love and care, we believe a greater community can and will arise and thrive. If you check in your order of service, you will find announcements about happenings at Westside and other useful information. If you're streaming on YouTube, announcements will have been scrolling on your screen. But they're also available on our website at westsideuuc.org and in our weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to if you'd like and haven't done so. There is a QR code on the order of service, or you can go to the website and subscribe there. I do have a couple of other announcements. The retreat that's coming up from November 15th through 17th, there are still a couple of positions available. If you're interested, check with Reverend Carol after the service. And lastly, our anti-racism course is starting after the service today. If you haven't signed up, that's fine. You can just, and want to attend, you can just show up for that, and that would be fine. Now I'll turn things over to Reverend Carol.
Morning, everyone. It's great to see you all. I am Reverend Carol Bodeau. I'm privileged to serve here as minister. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Special welcome to those of you who are with us virtually, whether today or in the future. I always like to remind us that no matter how many people are actually physically sitting in the room, there are a number of people with us in community who are with us virtually, and they are part of our community too. So we are welcoming them all. Today, we're going to be talking about the right to vote. So I know that there's a lot of tension around the topic of voting in elections right now. So we're going to be focusing on that for the next few weeks. So what I'd like to invite you to do as I invite our bowl to sound this morning is just get centered, because I know I cannot tell you the number of people in the last week and a half who have said to me, I'm really stressed out about the election. There's a lot of stress out there about the election. So this is an opportunity for us to just take a breath, come into our centers, and remember that we are whole and that every day is a gift.
Reverend Carol's going to be lighting our chalice this morning. We'll also light our 2 community candles, one for those near and far who are suffering in the world, keeping in our thoughts particularly the people of North Carolina and eastern part of Tennessee who are still struggling to recover from the hurricane. But we also like to take a moment to think that there are good things happening in the world and appreciate those things. The reading this morning comes from Frederick Douglass. It's called The Limits of Tyrants. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice which will be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress.
Thanks, Linda. So this morning's service is a wee bit of a history lesson. So I know that one of the things that is top in many of our minds right now is, of course, the election and voting. There's just the logistics of voting. I've been listening to lots of NPR, bits about the poor election officials this season and all the things they're having to deal with. And also just, the logistics in our own personal lives. For some of us, getting to the polls is a bit of a challenge. But the election itself is a big deal. Our media is currently filled with ads about what is a very contentious election season, and a lot of people, as I've said, are expressing everything from anxiety to outright depression about this election and how it's going to turn out. And we know that this election is going to be a historic one. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about it and about elections in general, how we respond to them. This week, we're going to focus on some history. Next week, we'll focus more on the personal, sort of emotional, psychological part of it. And who knows what we're going to do on the 10th of November. That is to be determined, depending on how things go. But today, we're going to talk about the history of voting rights in this country, in the United States of America. It is a history riddled with actually all the same sorts of concerns we have right now about elections, and that actually go back centuries. It's a history riddled with imbalances in voting access and voting rights, with unfair uses of power in shaping election results, and it's an ongoing struggle, and has been from the very beginning, to make elections more rather than less representative of the will of the people. So I want to recommend a book to you. This book, which is the resource I used, the primary resource I used for today, it's a book called Represent: The Unfinished Fight for the Vote. It's by Michael Eric Dyson and Marc Favreau. It's a really easy read, but it's chock full of really interesting information. And I'm gonna just kind of give you a skim across the surface of some of the most interesting things that it has to share. So it goes through the history of suffrage, suffrage is the word for the right to vote. And the book shares stories of a number of really unsung heroes in that history. I'll briefly touch on a couple of them, but if you're interested in that, I recommend the book. The authors of this book argue that the struggle for voting rights, for suffrage, is far from over. That ultimately we are going to be engaged in this struggle for a long time, and that there are things we can and should be doing to continue to make the process of electing our representatives and the officers of our country, to make that more fair and just and equitable. So the book opens with a quote that was published in the Maryland Gazette in 1776. And this was written by someone who, in those days, people loved to be anonymous when they published things, so they made up names for themselves. So this person called themselves the Watchman and said this: "The ultimate end of all freedom is the enjoyment of a right of free suffrage." Now, of course, remember the context here. The founders of the United States, and at that time the colonies, so this is at the time of the Declaration of Independence, the people doing this were fighting against taxation without representation, right? So the ability to have a voice, to be represented in decision-making processes, was central to this experiment, this early experiment of a democratic nation. For these original Americans, suffrage, the right to vote, was really the same thing as being free. But of course, there's a few caveats here. The founding fathers, and I say that very specifically, the founding fathers didn't actually intend a democracy. And of course, we still don't actually have an actual democracy. We live in a representative republic. We do not have a democracy. We do not have a one-to-one vote process. That's not how it works. The early debates, that some of which were expressed in the Federalist Papers, where some of these early founders were arguing about how things should be done, reveal that decisions about who should have a voice in the political sphere were a problem from the beginning. They argued about whether the new nation would be democratic, meaning the common people's voices would be heard equally with those with wealth and other kinds of power, or whether it would be representative, meaning that certain special people would be endowed with the power to speak for the larger community. So think about our electoral college, right? Think about the way our House of Representatives, the way things work. And of course, we ended up with a representative form of government. And that makes a lot of sense, given the context of the time that this happened. Let's think about the group of people who eventually wrote the Constitution of the United States of America. Of the 55 white men who drafted that document, half of them were slave owners. At that time, about 1/5 of the population of the new nation, so a number, and this is the percentage of the population, that's 1/5, about 700,000 people at that time were enslaved. And certainly even then, the inconsistencies between the phrase, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, which we all know from the Declaration of Independence, that statement and the factual reality of the country were very obvious to everyone. People were talking about it then, okay? They were talking about who should have a right to vote. They were arguing about it. The Constitution of the United States still does not explicitly give Americans the right to vote. In the beginning, that matter was left up to the states. The things that have been added, the amendments, are sort of like fixing that it's left up to the states. So in the beginning, the matter of who could vote was entirely left up to each state to decide. Now, over time, as inequalities and problems arose in various states and the collective consciousness started to rise across the nation on this issue of suffrage, amendments were added to the Constitution to clarify things. But as the authors of the book represent stress, the right is still not 100% guaranteed to everybody. So in the years immediately after the founding of the new nation, suffrage, the right to vote, was up to each state to decide. In the original first states, the only state that allowed women to vote was New Jersey. And that lasted for just a few years. That got taken away very quickly, okay? Native Americans were considered subjects of foreign states. They were not considered Americans. They were, and that's a whole other sermon that I will give some other time, because tribal sovereignty has pros and cons to it, when you're located within the confines of the geographic United States. But they were considered sovereign nations, so they were not considered American citizens. And some states allowed free blacks to vote, and slaves were disallowed voting in all states. So that meant that just after the founding of the nation, about 1/3 of the adult population in the United States had voting rights. Think about that. The majority of American adults were explicitly excluded from voting. And yet the words, the premises asserted in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, in fact, set the stage for centuries of struggle. Because, you know, people heard all men are created equal, and they were arguing about it in 1777 and 1783 and 1785, right? People took those words in and said, this should apply to me too. More and more disenfranchised folks fought for suffrage. Now, the first group to gain more power was free white men who didn't happen to own land. So in the beginning, the people who could vote in most states were white men who owned land, right? That was who got to vote. But over time, there were a lot of free white men who did not own land who wanted the right to vote. Some of you may know the history of Franklin, Tennessee. Anybody ever heard of the state of Franklin? Not Franklin near Nashville, but the state of Franklin. So at that time, the state, after the Revolution, the state of Tennessee did not exist. This area was part of North Carolina. But the North Carolina government didn't really want to deal with the costs of that stuff over the hill over here. And in North Carolina, landed men had the right to vote. And a bunch of rebels decided to establish their own new state and call it Franklin, up in the mountains. And they were mountain people. And they thought you should have the right to vote. They formed this whole new, now the state of North Carolina, eventually, there were a lot of fights and political maneuvering, and ultimately the state of Franklin was squashed. But one of the key issues that first version of Tennessee was founded around was the right of non-propertied white men to vote, which comes back, we hear more about this with Andrew Jackson, also a Tennessean. Okay. So people who didn't have land were starting to say, well, we should be able to vote too. By 1815, then, every new state admitted into the Union allowed for something called universal manhood suffrage, which meant that every man could vote. But how that was defined varied from state to state. In some places, to say universal manhood suffrage meant free white men who didn't own land. In some places, it meant any free man, including African American and African descended men. But the common man, the laborer, who was not part of the landed gentry in all across the new colony, the new nation, they were starting to get more rights to vote. At that time, roughly 80% of eligible voters showed up at the polls. Think about that. 80%. Our numbers are down to 50 or something like that? Or even lower in some, it's pretty low. One of the first clear demonstrations that even though 80% of the people were showing up to vote and that non-landed people had the right to vote, but we still didn't have a democracy, actually happened in 1824 with our very own Tennessean, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, the system was slightly different then. He won the popular vote in the 1824 presidential election. He won the majority of votes. But he was denied the presidency by the electoral process that happened at the time. It's complicated, I'm not gonna try to explain it, but what happened was that he was not chosen by who was then considered the electorate, which was a bunch of leaders, representatives. And that caused a ruckus, a huge ruckus. And so they changed the rules, and in 1828, he was elected in a landslide, supported by people who saw the electoral process as a problem. Now, please understand that I am not touting Andrew Jackson as a man for all the people, because he was not. He was an incredible racist and was horrible, particularly, he was horrible about any people of color. He was particularly destructive during his presidency to the Native Americans in particularly this part of the country, but just in general. He wanted more white men to have rights. But it was a big step. His presidency was a big change in how we vote. At this time, as universal manhood suffrage grew, so more and more people are getting the right to vote, right? What do you expect is going to happen to the people in power? How are they going to respond? They didn't like it. So in the North, so now we're thinking about 40 years before the Civil War at this point, between the 1820s, 1820 and 1860. People started to say too much of the riffraff is having a say in how we do things. So in the North, concerns about the increasing power of the common people, and particularly of free black voters, gave rise to increasing restrictions on voting. So they said, we got to clamp down on this. And places where women were starting to be allowed, nope. Places where women were starting to have more of a voice, where African Americans and African descended people were starting to have a voice, nope. So that, in turn, gave rise to the abolitionist movement, which was sort of already percolating, but people like Frederick Douglass, Linda gave us our chalice lighting from the activist Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass and another man, Robert Purvis, also an African-American man, Robert Purvis worked with William Lloyd Garrison to found the American Anti-Slavery Society. And a big part of what they were fighting for was not just to abolish slavery, but also to make sure that all men had the right to vote. They argued about women, we're not there yet, but they wanted to make sure that all men had the right to vote. Now, right alongside the movement, so you have to imagine there's a movement to end slavery and to allow equal rights for people of color. And there's also a movement to give women equal rights and the right to vote. These were not without contention between them, okay? When the radical Republicans put their first president, Abraham Lincoln, in the White House, and then ultimately the Civil War was won in favor of their northern perspective, voting rights improved. They did not get fixed. They improved for previously enslaved peoples. The 1867 Reconstruction Act, so imagine Reconstruction, right? The war ends, and there are what are called the Black Codes. That's the name that they were given in the South. They were very restrictive, violent policies to restrict newly freed people from having power. But in 1867, the Reconstruction Act abolished those codes, right? The war ends in 1865, and there's a couple years of just horrible treatment of the newly freed people. 1867, the Reconstruction Act abolishes these codes and allows black men the right to vote, okay? This was sometimes called the Second American Revolution because it had a huge impact on representation in the United States. This meant that previously enslaved peoples were suddenly in positions of power. They were representatives. They were on school boards. They were in all kinds of positions in state governments, in county governments. There were governors. This was a huge revolution in American culture. Here's the irony of that. The Reconstruction Act abolished these codes in the South as part of Reconstruction, but it didn't apply to the northern states, where they continued to have restrictions on the vote for people of color. So during that time period, you could live in the South and be a previously enslaved person and actually have political voice. This isn't how we think of it usually. This is not how I used to think of it. But be in the North and be a freed black man and not necessarily have the right to vote. Isn't that interesting? I had no clue that was the case. So it's been a struggle all along. Now, one of the biggest tensions at this time in the suffrage movement was the tension between the women trying to get the right to vote and the movement for people of color to have the right to vote. White women, African American men, African American women, and Native Americans, depending on what state you were in and what particular year it was, they were all struggling to establish solid equal voting rights. And there were huge debates around and within these groups about who should get what when. One of the most disturbing podcasts I've ever listened to was about early suffragettes and the racism of early suffragettes, okay? We tend to teach and think about the history of the suffragettes as liberal and open-minded, and that is not accurate, okay? There was a lot of prejudice and racism that got played out in the debates between these groups as they juggled to see who would be first and who would dilute the movement, okay? So one of the most famous suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she was in my list of cool people. She's not on my list of cool people anymore. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was explicitly very racist. When the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution was adopted by the government in 1869, so the 15th Amendment to the Constitution says that citizens of the United States to vote, the rights to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Okay, so here's what happened. The first thing that was going to be amended to the Constitution was the right to allow black men to vote, okay? A lot of the white women did not like that. It made them very unhappy. And so when Congress voted to approve this and then sent it to the states for ratification, there were conferences and debates. And one of these happened, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the foremost suffragists at the moment, advocating for women to have the right to vote, stood up and gave a big speech. She made public comments in those debates that were horrifyingly racist. Because the 15th Amendment did nothing for women, white women or women of color, or Native Americans, they were still barred from voting. Elizabeth Cady Stanton explicitly stated, and I'm not going to use her language, you can Google it, it's awful, explicitly stated that African American men were inferior to white women, too ignorant, absolutely not qualified, and should absolutely not be given the power to vote because of the negative influence that would have. That white educated women were far superior and should be allowed to vote. It's sort of horrifying. And of course, at that time, voter suppression in many places still made this new right after the 15th Amendment very difficult, if not impossible, to actually accomplish. So literacy tests were one of the most common tools used in many places to require voters to prove a level of education about government function that frankly most of us wouldn't be able to pass, let alone people who are struggling to survive economically. So if you're going to participate in our anti-racism class, we're going to take one of these literacy tests in a couple of weeks. So that was one of the most common tools. You'd show up, and to be allowed to vote, you had to take the test and you had to pass the test before you were allowed to vote. The other thing that was really common was poll taxes. Poll taxes were required payments that you would make. You'd have to pay to be allowed to vote. You know, those were not allowed until 1964 for federal elections and 1966 for state elections. Now, eventually, women were given the right to vote with the adoption of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. Now, that happened after over a year of constant protests outside the White House by women, a number of women, some of whom were imprisoned and tortured for their protesting. And they weren't violent protests, they were nonviolent protests. They just stood outside the White House with signs, rang bells, stuff like that. A couple of them went to prison and were tortured terribly for that. And yet, women of color and all Native Americans were still barred from voting. Now, among the activists fighting for suffrage for Native Americans and women of color was a Yanton Sioux woman named Zitkala-Sa. And I thought it would be interesting to just tell you a little bit about her, since we're coming up on that season where we tend to romanticize Native people. And she is an example of someone who was romanticized for white political purposes, and yet persevered. So Zitkala-Sa, her name in her tribal language means red bird. She's Yanton Sioux. She had grown up for a while on the Yanton Reservation in South Dakota, where she was very happy. She was then removed from the reservation and taken to a boarding school. And if any of you know anything about the boarding schools, they were pretty awful. Their purpose was to eliminate cultural identity for Native American peoples. And so she went to a boarding school, and she saw pros and cons to that. She tells the story of having her hair cut off, which for her people was a powerful sign of identity and strength. To have the hair cut off meant that you were a prisoner. That was how prisoners were treated. And they cut off all the children's hair. They were also not allowed to use their own languages and things like that. But at boarding school, she did also receive a white education, which later served her well in advocating within the white community. She later became a very powerful and vocal artist, activist, and political leader. And she was one of the voices advocating for Native American people, and particularly Native American women, to have the right to vote and to have political agency. One of the things that happened is she was embraced by many of the leaders, the white women, leaders of the suffragette movement, but they wanted to portray her as a romanticized historical Indian figure. So they insisted that she dress in traditional garb rather than show up in, the clothes she would wear every day, and that she tell stories about the past. But she was smart, and she was able to advocate. She kind of got around this, worked around it, and was able to become a powerful advocate for her people. She became president in 1914 of the Society of American Indians, which was modeled after the newly developing NAACP, and she continued to fight for Native American suffrage even after these other amendments were approved. In 1924, Congress finally passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which made Native Americans citizens of the United States. Now, that sounds great, 1924. But despite this change in federal law, it took 40 more years to remove all the state-level laws and restrictions that barred Native people from voting. And more than that, in her own state, in South Dakota, local courts and poll workers consistently physically barred and used all kinds of tactics to bar Native Americans from voting well into the 1970s, including a lot of violence. Of course, the battles for equal access to representation continued after that, right? In 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, as young people who had fought in Vietnam came home to discover they were old enough to fight but not old enough to vote. So the voting age was dropped from 21 to 18 in response to these returning soldiers who had sacrificed so much and yet had no voice in our representative government. And in 1975, amendments to the Voting Rights Act required states to begin supporting non-English speakers in having access to voting. And we all know that we are not done. We're not done. We're not done. Two of the biggest problems which Dyson and Favreau describe in great detail in the book are gerrymandering and dark money. So the former of these, gerrymandering, which it turns out, I didn't know this, you can read the whole story in the book, is based on a politician whose last name was Jerry, like literally Gerry, and a cartoonist portrayed him as a monster that was half him and half salamander. Who knew? I had no idea, which is why we have the term gerrymandering, because the monster was called the gerrymander. But anyway, so the gerrymandering is the practice of redrawing districts so that the votes of people who happen to be in power drawing the districts, those votes count more than the people they don't want to have power. Now, an example of how gerrymandering can impact elections was seen, I've got a great example, this is from the book, was seen in the shifts that happened in Pennsylvania between the 2006 and the 2012 elections. So here's the story. In 2006, in the House of Representative elections, I'm going to give you numbers. Democrats received 2,229,091 votes, okay? And Republicans received 1,732,163 votes. And as a result, at that time, the electoral process awarded 11 seats to Democrats and 8 to Republicans, which very simple, like seat of your pants math, kind of makes sense, right? 2,200,000 to 1,700,000, 11 to 8, you know, close enough, right? But in 2010, the Republican Party gained control of Congress. And because it was a census year, districts are allowed to be redrawn in census years, 10 years, okay? It was a census year. Redistricting happened, and the Republican people in power redrew the lines in Pennsylvania. And here's what happened in 2012. In 2012, Democrats received 2,793,538 votes, and Republicans received 2,710,070 votes. So those are pretty equal. That's literally only about 80,000 difference between those, which was a pretty darn close race. But the actual seats awarded no longer in any way matched the actual balance of the votes. That year, Republicans, because of redistricting, received 13 seats, and the Democrats received 5. So that's how gerrymandering works, okay? Now, the same year that redistricting was happening in Pennsylvania, there was an important Supreme Court decision. And it was the decision between Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. And this Supreme Court decision eroded restrictions on the use of financial influence to shift elections. So Citizens United was it was an organization. It was I don't know if you'd call it a corporation. It was not a nonprofit, I don't think. Considered a corporation. Citizens United was an organization whose purpose was to oppose the election of Hillary Clinton. And they made a movie, which at that time was restricted. They were not allowed to do that by federal election law. They were not allowed to have such a huge influence in the election. And so actually they were not allowed to use their film for the election. But they didn't like that. So they sued the Federal Elections Commission, and that eventually went to the Supreme Court. Their case argued that two important things were argued in that continue to apply today. The first is that they argued that spending money was an act of free speech. Okay, that they had the right to spend their money however they wanted to. And second, they argued that corporations should be considered individuals or citizens. That a corporation should be treated as a citizen in such matters. And they won. Okay? Which means that now corporations can fund elections and often do so through complex channels and layers of identity. I know you all have heard stories about like how to track who's What exactly is that anonymously named weird little thing, and why are they giving so much money to this or that candidate? So these things, gerrymandering, and particularly this Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission decision, you take those changes and you amplify them with the impact of social media, right? The social media's ability to increase and distribute messages that undermine elections. Things are problematic, to say the least, right now. I heard a Republican head of, actually the guy who's the head of the elections in Pennsylvania now, who's a Republican, who spoke about how concerned he is about how severely our election process has been undermined, and how much social media has impacted that, and how his family's been threatened, his life has been threatened, how much danger. And and he's a vocal advocate of saying previous elections were not, they were correctly decided, right? He's very clear about that. He says, yes, there was a difference in, he's not a fan of the conspiracy theory, I guess what I'm trying to say, in a way that is appropriate for a nonprofit to say publicly. He spoke and he said, it is really hard for election officials right now. And the interviewer said to him, well, why would you take the job then if you know your family, your kids are being threatened? And he said, because we have a responsibility to fix this. I feel a responsibility to fix this. Which is what the authors of the book also feel, that we can't give up on this, that people had to be really courageous. Think of all of the people in the past who've had to put themselves in all kinds of discomfort to make sure that people were equally represented. So they give a list at the end of the book. They give some guidance on what we can do. Here are a few ideas that are out there. They're not advocating necessarily for any of these, and there's a lot of them, and they aren't necessarily, some of them are mutually exclusive or hard to work with each other. And they ask, which of these would you be in favor of? So here's a list. Number 1, eliminate the Electoral College. Yay. Function more, yeah, okay. So here's what's really interesting. They give a number about the House of Representatives. If we eliminated the Electoral College and the House of Representatives actually had kept pace with the population and representation, I think we'd have something like 3,000 representatives or some ridiculous number like that, right? So that's talk about a contextual change from when it was created. So that's one option. The other option is expand the House of Representatives so that it's actually representative. Problems with how do you do that? Another really interesting suggestion that I hadn't thought about is they say that there is now computer software that is explicitly nonpartisan, designed to be nonpartisan, that you could use to create fair districts. You could literally use this software to create districts that are not being created by people with biases, which seems like fascinating. One of the things that they say really is happening, thank you to COVID actually, is to make it easier to vote. COVID actually helped us in many ways with our voting process. It caused some hoopla as well, but it actually has created more access to voting in many places with virtual voting and with mail-in voting and things like that. I love that you're rescuing a little creature. Mary Frances is rescuing one of our little relatives. I love that. Okay, another suggestion, replace partisan voting with ranked voting, ranked choice voting. So instead of being like, you're gonna vote for the Republican or the Democrat, it'd be like, here's 5 people, number them. I like this one best, and this one second, and this one third, and this one fourth, and this one fifth. And then you count up the ranked voting. It's an interesting idea. Another interesting area is changing laws that restrict incarcerated and previously incarcerated voters. There are restrictions on that. Here's a doozy that I'd never heard before, and it made me go, huh. Make voting mandatory. How would you do that? That's just a fascinating idea. I don't. Australia does that. Okay, that is fascinating. All right, and then this is about the dark money. Place restrictions on the use of so-called dark money and the influence of corporations on voting. Right now, the money flow is having a huge impact on our election process. And there have been times in the past in the US where non-citizens were allowed to vote. And some people, in some places at some periods. That is possible also. Some people suggest we allow non-citizen voting. You think about the undocumented population in the United States does an enormous amount of the work in the United States and has no voice in that sense. All of those, of course, come with pros and cons, right? I know that all of you out there are like thinking that you have this favorite or that not favorite or whatever, right? Given that problems around representation have been with us for the 240 years our nation has existed, it is not likely those problems are going to evaporate soon. But I find this a little reassuring. Troubling on one hand, but also reassuring, because it's not new. And it's been going on for a really long time. We are in a historic period, but we're not in a new problem. We're in a really old problem. So next week, we're going to be talking about the emotional, psychological part of the election process, the personal stress, the emotional turmoil that comes with these kinds of moments in our national history. Even a not so contentious election can be a big deal for us. And we are currently in the middle of an election that takes contentious to levels I've never seen before. None of us actually knows how the next few weeks and months are going to play out, despite all of our anxieties and speculation. The one thing that I'm hearing people say with some certitude is that we are certainly not going to know the outcome of the election on November 5th or 6th. That it's fairly likely that that is going to take a minute, and it probably will be bumpy. And another thing that we do know is this. People like Zitkala-Sa and Frederick Douglass and Robert Purvis and suffragettes and all kinds of people whose names we will never know have been staying courageous and committed to their values since the beginning of this American experiment. And we are called to do the same. Like all of them, we are called to live our values and do so with both individual conviction and also collective support. So our cycle of topics and talks about the election is kind of meant to be a mix of those. A little bit of conviction, like, ooh, we really need to pay attention to this, and also some collective support, because we always work better when we work together and collectively. So we're going to sing a song today. We're going to sing a song that composer Pete Seeger says was discovered, the words to this were discovered by his fellow artist Wally Hill. And these words, it's number 157 in your hymnal, Step by Step. So if you open that up and look to it, the words, step by step, the longest march, I'm going to grab my copy of it here. Step by step, the longest march can be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none. And by union what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none. So this idea that collective action, collective intention is powerful, has been a part of the suffrage movements of all peoples through all of time. You can look, if you want to read the music, you can read it in your hymnal, or you can look at it on our wonderful new projector. So we're going to sing this song together. Sandra, I'd like to do it twice through. If you'll give us a few bars of intro when we start. That came from the preamble to a constitution for a coal miners union, right? So I'm going to invite you, let's stand up. Why not? Let's stand up for a minute. Just to get you moving, just to get you feeling. And we're going to, if Sandra will give us a couple bars to replay it, the melody for us, and then we will sing it twice through. Step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none, singly none. Again, step by step, the longest march can be won, can be won. Many stones can form an arch, singly none, singly none. And by union what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill, singly none, singly none. Thank you. You can be seated. So, you know, one of the things we try to do here is to do things together, to be like, you know, those many drops of water turning the mill. There are many things we can do to make a difference in the world. So I want to make a couple of announcements about justice and generosity opportunities that are in front of us right now. So the Green Sanctuary team, the committee, has set for us the challenge of a plastic-free week from November 4th to November 10th. There are handouts in the back of the room. I believe those are also available online. If they're not, we'll make them so. Let's make them so they're equally accessible. There are handouts about what you can do, all right? So another thing that we don't talk about very much is actually doing things here in the congregation. Lots of things need to get done. Like, people have to organize the activities we do. People have to coordinate the activities that we do. And we are always seeking your support just for those simple things here. So we need some more people to help with greeting. We need some more people to help with our safety team. If you're interested in helping, those are our two particular highest needs right now, is helping with our safety team and helping with greeting. Please let me know after the service. The greeters show up early and they're friendly at the door. And they hand out orders of service. That I see people being voluntold in the room. But it's a really great thing to do, but it also, you know, there's a few people who do that, and more people would be great. The safety team, we need some more people on our safety team. It's a very small team right now, and we need to write some policies and things like that. So we'd love to have a few more people on that team. And frankly, we'd like to have a wider representation on that team of people with different ages and backgrounds. So anybody who's interested in that, let me know. And I would like to make an announcement of gratitude, because we have recently had a new volunteer to do something, not be voluntold, but actively volunteer to do something really important. So Leslie Brussels-Smith, will you stand up, Leslie, so everybody knows who Leslie is? Leslie has just volunteered to be our new religious exploration coordinator for our children's programs. Yay! Yay, thank you. Awesome, thank you, Leslie. So we've been trying to restart our children's programs since COVID, right? During COVID, children's programs went away in most churches, right? And ours did too. And we had, at that time, we had a staff member who coordinated that program, and that person left. And we've been trying to get it restarted, which is a challenge. It's a very challenging thing to do. And it is so awesome to have someone who's willing to volunteer to coordinate that. So right now we have child care volunteers, and we're in the process of working on getting them background checked. And then starting in the winter, starting in January, Leslie and her daughter Liza will be actually teaching regular content-based children's RE once a month. the first Sunday of each month. So if you have people in your life who have little tiny people or little medium-sized people that would be interested in being here, we would love to get their information. We would love to have them come visit. During December, our December 15th service will be our holiday celebration, hanging of the greens, the holiday play, and things like that. And it's going to be specifically geared so that kids who haven't been here very much can enjoy it and participate and kind of get to know us. So we're targeting that December 15th service as a way to start to really welcome families with children and prepare for monthly religious exploration programs. So please keep those in mind, okay? Always a reminder that you can financially contribute to the work we do. We have 2 boxes in the back of the room with 2 different QR codes. This is the new system. We're constantly changing up the systems to try to improve them. We have 1 box, which is for donations directly to Westside, and the other box is for donations to our current Justice and Generosity partner. The practice of dividing the donations is done. We're not doing that anymore. So just a reminder, if you make a cash donation that's not designated, we do not split it for our Justice and Generosity partners anymore. We are taking those as separate donations. So if you would like to contribute to the current partner, Awesome Found, which Morgan Riegelspa spoke about recently, that goes in the Justice and Generosity donations. You can use that QR code or that box. Okay, so many things going on. And I want to just give a shout out to the very simple justice act that Mary Frances did when she rescued our little cousin. What was it? It was some sort of caterpillar, some sort of little creature. That was an act of justice and generosity. I mean that. I don't mean that as a joke. I don't mean that ironically. I mean that as an actual act of justice and generosity, to have enough respect for the other species that share our planet to actually attend to them, even the cockroaches, yes, and the mosquitoes and all of them. We can set boundaries with respect and love and kindness. All right. So there are so many things we can all do. I hope that as we're getting into this election season, we can continue to support one another. I'm going to invite you, if you would like to do so, to join in our closing circles today. We'll see how far my microphone goes. Yeah. I'll be tethered to the microphone. Everyone will adapt to support me. Okay, here we go. So representation. Representation means that your voice matters. I hope that as you go into this day, this week, this election, you understand that who you truly are, who you authentically are, matters. That your voice is welcome here, that your voice of disagreement, that your voice of new perspectives, that your voice that may be different than what you think the people next to you think, your voice matters here. We can be a model for the larger world by the way we act with one another. So let this place be an inspiration and a support to you as you go out into that world that is sometimes so challenging. May you go in peace and also in passion to live your values. May it be so.
Thank you.
Yeah. And our anti-racism class will start